Hello and welcome to the podcast Peace Matters, an IAP and Ponto podcast which deals with contemporary conflicts all around the globe and how to solve them. On the 27th of November 2023, the IAP organized an international conference dealing with the South Caucasus, and we are going to release a series of podcasts dealing with Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, regional powers, and European Union integration, possible European Union integration of Georgia.
Hi. This is the third episode in our short podcast series on the South Caucasus region. I'm Marila Huscher from the International Institute for Peace, and to my guests, I'm talking about Georgia this time. In November, the European Commission recommended that Georgia receives the EU candidate status. This, however, comes with preconditions. With my guests, I'm discussing what those preconditions are, what other issues are remaining on Georgia's path to the European Union. My guests are Stefan Meister from the German Council on Foreign Relations and Akhvlediani from the Center of the European Policy Studies. I hope you find this discussion interesting. So, we're talking about Georgia with you, and my first question would go to Tina. It is about the recent decision of the European Commission to grant or to recommend the European Council to grant the EU candidate status to Georgia, which is hailed and celebrated in Georgia. It is still like a question whether it gets it. We will wait for December. But basically the question is, if you can just say in general, like what were the conditions with it and what are we to expect?
Sure. So this is really a big thing for Georgian people because Georgia's population is really overwhelmingly supporting their European choice and European future. So that has been celebrated, and sometimes we have to explain, and this is not a final decision. The European Council should approve it, but this is still a big step for Georgia to have the recommendation from the European Commission on the granting its the candidacy. However, it comes with the conditions, and now explanation here, the European Commission or European Council, they don't expect Georgia to fulfill these new conditions. Now until December. However, these conditions bring a very important message for the Georgia. What has to be done from the country is for to complete its homework for the European integration. So the new conditions are 9 by the count, and this is also very symbolic because the old set of priorities set out by the European Commission back in 2022 was 12, and now by the assessment of the European Commission, Georgia has fulfilled only 3 out of 12 conditions. So the new set of priorities now contain 9 steps, 9 priorities, not 12. However, their scope is really larger than it was even in the case of the old 12 list of priorities. To maybe mention what really comes as a new addition, these are the proper conduct of the upcoming 2024 elections, which now appears into the list of conditions and priorities. Georgia's alignment within EU's CFSP, the security and foreign policy, common security and foreign policy, also decrease on the foreign manipulation in Georgia. Basically, that indirectly means the Russian-led manipulation in the Georgia's making. And the rest, like judicial reforms, human rights, de-oligarchization, anti-corruption reforms, these are still in there, inclusion of the civil society. So basically, the scope of the conditions are really not, it's no way reduced. It's actually quite larger. So Georgia has a lot of work to do. And this is, I think, a clear message also from the European Commission, what country needs to do in order to progress on its European integration path.
So the work starts right now, or it should have started earlier, but
no.
It
so Georgia could have and should have delivered more ambitious results on the reforms because the country has very good institutional base and it has economic preparedness to deliver more ambitious reforms. What we've seen in the Georgia's case, it had rather ticking the box exercise complete with the old priorities because the country lacks a little bit the political will. Because these reforms are very systematic, they require political will. Otherwise, they're not in-depth, systemic reforms. They're not there. And so this case also highlights, European Commission really points to Georgia. Look, you have to do the homework. It's not gone. It's not fulfilled. You have to do more. However, the recommendation still comes to grant Georgia's candidacy, and I think it's very much geopolitical in this case, not so much merit-based.
Yeah, exactly. And that would be my next question to Stefan, because we know there are some other candidate countries, namely in the Western Balkans, and they were not too happy, I would say, with the decision with the Commission's decision about Georgia and about Ukraine and Moldova, because it proceeded very fast compared to their processes, right? And as Tina already mentioned, it's rather the geopolitical decision. So the question is like, why is Georgia so important for the European Union, or is it important? Why is the geopolitics coming into play?
No, I think Georgia is a key country in the so-called post-Soviet region. It's a key country in the South Caucasus. It's through the Black Sea, a bridge into the South Caucasus, but then also further in the direction of the Caspian Sea. Georgia has in the past, after the Rose Revolution, did really comprehensive reforms in the legal system on corruption. It has built up an institutional base which you don't have in you could say in any other post-Soviet country. So it's by its reforms it did in the past, and it's still living on these reforms they did in the past, but also by its geopolitical location in the South Caucasus as a bridge also between Asia and Europe. It's a key country, and we can see how Russia is really working on to buy into Georgia, to impact also on Georgian politics. We have two conflict zones or disputed regions of Georgia which are occupied by Russia, or which are under Russian control. So Russia really tries also to impact on Georgia, and I think it's really crucial also for the EU in a neighborhood where Russia, which has started a large-scale war against Ukraine, is trying to keep its sphere of influence, undermine also the will of the people, and trying to keep or to develop authoritarian regimes, to have this opening with the candidate status, with the enlargement, to be a player also in this region, and also being part of the negotiation of the new regional order, which is now negotiated between Russia, Turkey, Iran, China, and the EU in the end. And I think Georgia, as I said, is here key.
Exactly. Hopefully EU is not in the end. Hopefully it will be more active as well. But let me turn now a little bit more to the domestic politics. You already mentioned, Tina, the parliamentary elections next year. And we know that there is like this very strong political polarization in Georgia. Basically, we have two big parties, the Georgian Dream, the governing party, and the UNM, United National Movement, which is in the opposition right now. And the prospects are that these parties are very likely to dominate the parliament. So my question would be, if what does it mean for this political development, and if there is some sort of a third force or a coalition of parties that could break this polarization?
I think that would be ideal if we had a third force of the coalition, which requires the opposition parties to really stand together, to unite. However, I don't see that right now. There is still a lot time to go. I mean, for Georgia, 1 year is a lot of time because anything can happen. It's a very turbulent region, unfortunately. So, but right now, as the things stand, I don't see a unification of the opposition parties, but that would be ideal. What we observe in the country and why political polarization is so severe is, of course, the lack of political will from the ruling party that has majority to cooperate with the opposition parties, but also opposition parties follow their narrow political party interests. We see lack of, finding the common grounds for the country's interests, for the country's European future. If this was the priority, maybe there would be more common grounds for the parties to come together, to sit at the table, and to really cooperate better than the cooperation we observe right now. So within this context, these upcoming elections, of course, are very, very important. The challenge here, however, is the degree of manipulation the ruling party still has, and degree of influence they still have to influence the election. And what we can observe by the reports and monitoring missions in the past in Georgia during presidential and parliamentary elections is that Georgian Dream has built a very strong tools to influence the elections before the day of the elections. They have sort of vote buying behavior that was observed in the past, a lot of threats, particularly in the regions. They have a lot of administrative powers, which was really badly abused during the last parliamentary elections, so these are still in there because they still control a lot. So this is some challenging factor that we will see will not disappear. And I think this will also affect how the elections will go ahead, and its transparency, its fair conduct is under the question mark. And on top of this, the people who do not have a strong candidate to vote for. So this together does not give us a good basis or good ground to be optimistic about the election outcomes, but let's see.
Right. Georgian politics, as I understand, is very much personality based. So you need like a strong front man or woman who would lead the party.
Precisely.
Stefan, you already mentioned Russia and Russia's role in the region, and we now spoke about the governing party. So there is now this tendency that Georgian Dream is actually turning more and more to Russia. Yeah, they also had some months ago they wanted to implement in the country a very similar law to Russia's foreign agent law that would suppress the civil society. The trade with Russia is somehow growing again, despite the EU sanctions, and Georgia also didn't join the sanctions regime. So what does it mean basically? Is Russia kind of starting to dominate again the Georgian political system, despite the fact that the population in Georgia is very much pro-Western and anti-Russian? And in this region, this dichotomy kind of is very clear, right? So you cannot have both, sort of, right?
Yeah. No, I think we have to understand that the de facto leader of the country is Bidzina Ivanishvili, who stands behind the Georgian Dream Party, and this party serves his interests, also his personal interests, and he has become rich in Russia in the 1990s, so he's also part of this Russian political culture. He has close ties, also not only economic but also personal ties in Russia, and that opens also for Russia channels of influence on Georgian politics. Yeah, because it's a very similar way of doing governance, doing politics, with informal ties, with administrative resources, with benefiting also from the power position that they have. I would not say this is an entirely pro-Russian government, but it wants to benefit from trade with Russia, from circumventing sanctions, for instance, also against Russia. But it was this regime or this government also wants to benefit from the EU and also economically benefit. So it's positioning itself in between in a way. But the way it's doing politics, the way it's also implementing increasingly laws to stay in power, because that's the main goal, to stay in power at any cost and prepare the election in the way that Georgian Dream can only win these elections, is getting more and more authoritarian. And it's not only the foreign agent law. We have a media law, we have an LGBT law, so we have a lot of laws which are more or less copied from the Russian legal system, and that increases the vulnerability of Georgia, of the Georgian state, but also that increases the ties, the connections with Russia, and in the end also Russian influence. We didn't talk about disinformation and also polarization through the discourse, where Russia also plays a role, but Russia is also an element of the domestic discourse between the opposition and the ruling party. In terms of blaming the other side, being more pro-Russian or being a Russian agent. So it's also as a topic polarizing Georgian politics and Georgian society.
Right. But I take from that for the ruling party, it's not about Russia per se, it's about their own power in the country, and whoever helps them to stay in power, they will go with those actors, right?
And Russia is a model in a way in terms of staying in power,
right.
and keeping the power is becoming more influential. So it's a kind of a norm setter also for this government, which is building on a legacy which was very transatlantic. So the transatlantic integration, also EU rapprochement. They did a lot of reforms also in some sectors, but we can see it, especially in the political field, that Russia is becoming more and more model.
Yeah. In connection to that, I want to ask you, Tina, about the EU as a norm setter and the association agreement that Georgia has with the European Union, which also includes the free trade area with the EU, which means, or the idea of this whole project maybe was to bring Georgia closer also in terms of standards, economic standards, but also in terms of norms and political institutions, right? So how do you assess that? Did this agreement and specifically the free trade area live up to their potential?
Sure. First of all, let's start with that Georgia's clear European orientation didn't start with the current government. It started with the previous government, which was led by Akhvlediani. And the focus was really about Georgia's integration, reintegration into the European family, Euro-Atlantic integration. And the alignment and the foundations were set by then. And these agreements are very deep and comprehensive with their nature, like the DCFTA or the association agreement. And of course, there was a long time dedicated to negotiations, which was started by the previous government, although they were signed by the current government, so they were like more onto the implementation side of these agreements. And these are very important treaties, so-called, because they really prepared Georgia to approximate EU legislation and to come in line with the EU policies, key policies, but also to reform its institutions in line with the EU practices. So, and Georgia has done a lot. If we look at the reports published by the European Commission earlier this year that really assesses the implementation of the association agreements or the DCFTAs, we see that the country is really front runner. It really surpasses Moldova, for instance, and scores very closely with Ukraine. So the reforms have been very successful. They've done a lot. Right now, the key challenges remain on the implementation of the legislation, which has been approximated, which has been adopted, but it's not about just the laws on the paper, but their implementation, which also requires political will, which is, sometimes in the key areas is really missing in Georgia. However, as I said, the good news is country has a very good institutional base and a very good economic preparedness. To zoom in what happened regarding its trade agreement, the DCFTA, DCFTA has a very wide scope. Georgia unilaterally liberalized trade with the EU even both before it signed the DCFTA, because Georgia followed in general trade liberalization long before it signed the DCFTA with the EU.
I think it also has free trade with China, right? And
Indeed. And Georgia is the one country that also has the free trade agreement with Hong Kong in the region. So Georgia has been very liberal in terms of its economic trade policies. But this agreement, I think, didn't bring as much trade dynamics as it was expected. And here, this again pinpoints at the fact that trade and business is something that is done in practice, and only adopting the laws or even being in compliance with the EU standards will not necessarily translate the next day into the boosted trade. Because, for instance, with the SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures or the technical barriers to trade, there is a whole system of the checking them, whether they're in place, whether they really meet the EU standards. And this requires other capacity beyond having the laws in practice, like having the laboratory in the country that is in compliance with the EU standards. So the products, before they're sent to the European Union, can be checked on the ground rather than sent first and then being returned somewhere in the middle from Bulgaria or the entry gate to the EU single market. And such laboratory, for instance, doesn't exist in Georgia. It should be there. It should be really lobbied from the government side. Also, the EU should support building such. So that would really help Georgia's trade, or utilizing all the benefits that the agreement offers. Also, there are no trade corridors because we're speaking about a country that doesn't have a land border with the EU. It's only the Black Sea that is the entry gate through Bulgaria and Romania to the EU. The posting or the transportation costs are very high. So SMEs, the benefits extended to the SMEs are very, very, minor. And so there are plenty of issues that really require more targeted, tailored policies from the government. And of course, EU's help to really reap the benefits of the agreements, which are right now not basically there.
Exactly. But that brings me to another question regarding China, of course, because China is also, in terms of trade, is a very, good market to have access to, and Georgia does have this access. And this summer, they even signed a strategic partnership with China. Would be interesting to know what that means exactly, and also in terms of trade and other, Chinese presence in the country? What is it? To what extent? Do you think, maybe a question to you both, the geopolitical and the economic aspects of that, right? Because as far as I know, there is also a talk about this deep sea port. Who will actually run the construction and control it? Yeah, exactly. So what's your take on that? Yeah?
Sure. So China is an important player in how these coexist with the trading with the EU is that China really offers the country cheap products, much cheaper than the EU can offer. So this is reflected into the import statistics. Georgia is still a poor economy, right? It's an emerging economy, but a lot of majority of the population is still poor. They cannot afford all the EU goods that are much more expensive than the Chinese goods are. So that's on the imports. That's what has been boosting China's imports into the country. And the second one is really the Georgia's exports, because of course, coming into compliance with EU standards, which is underway, the country has adopted thousands and thousands of the EU measures, but still it's costly. So when the companies are there, they can also, export to China, where they don't have to come into compliance with all these standards, which are costly for them. So that room was also exploited. So in both the imports and the exports, we could see, particularly during the pandemic, the spikes into the trade data. And this is again dictated, we talk about markets, right? Market goes where is the cost saving, where is efficiency. So that's this kind of competition factor of China. Now, what China wants also is the access also to of course, Georgia's market, but Georgia is a very small market. That's not an end goal. So Georgia really offers China a very good entry point to the EU single market, because this DCFTA is in place, and this is a perfect for China to access the EU market. And again, geopolitical, geostrategic location of Georgia can be very well exploited by China. For instance, when the DCFTA has come into force, there was one Chinese company that tripled, I think the increase was even 9-fold of their exports to the EU market. There was a Chinese company based in Georgia, specialized on the very specific narrow niche products, and then the market was just exploited. So Chinese are welcome to the country. There are no constraints, right? It's very easy to open the business in Georgia. There is no constraints on that. They can come, they can set up the branches, they can set up the businesses, they can access the EU markets or use Georgia as a corridor to send the goods to the EU market. So that's on the trade. And of course, the ports are very strategically important, and investments from China are there. China can offer the money, and Georgia doesn't have necessarily all the money, or sometimes the government, as we saw in the past, could refuse the macrofinancial assistance offered by the EU because it came with all the conditions on the justice and rule of law reforms. So China can bring the money without conditions. So that's kind of easy money that can be then used Georgia, but in that way, Georgia loses its control of the strategic points to China. So China is very much into the play, and this is why it's also very important that Georgia does not, derail from its European integration path, because being in line with the EU policies, staying on the track of the European integration is much less threatening for Georgia's independence or freedom or its fundamental values than being in line with China or having strategic partnerships with China. And I hope the government takes that seriously.
Yeah. Stefan, how do you see this? China and the EU in Georgia, are they reconcilable actors? Can they act together, or is there some sort of competition between them?
I think the other aspect from the Georgian side is also leverage, building up leverage on the EU, on other actors, and also telling, look, we have also an alternative, which is not Russia, but it is China, and then maybe also do bargaining on some issues. So it's also this, I think, this kind of strategic partnership, whatever it means, you can have a lot of strategic partnerships, is also about the discourse, but also about leveraging towards the EU. And I think the big question is really if China and Chinese consortium is getting the beat for the Akhvlediani consortium, which should become the big deep sea port for Georgia, and then also the entry point to the European market, which could be attractive also with the middle corridor for China. But that also means the question is then under which conditions it will be built, and how much influence also China will then get on Georgian economy, on Georgian politics. Also infrastructure projects are often also not only about business, but also about other questions of if it's corruption, if it's influencing also on decision making. So I think Georgia wants to become like a hub also, and like wants to benefit from different angles, and not giving up the Russian option, the Chinese option, and the European option. And I think that will be really the question: how far they go, how much they also will integrate here with China. I think China is the fourth important trading partner of Georgia. So it is important, but it's not the most important.
Who are the ones before? Is it Russia?
EU is the first one, the first major, as a bloc, not as single EU member states, but as the bloc is the major trade partner.
And then it's Russia, I think.
Turkey.
Turkey.
The Turkey's economic links with Turkey is very, very strong. Yes.
Okay.
So it's a lot of trade also, and China is also important for building infrastructure in Georgia, even if it's paid maybe by other institutions, also by European institutions. It's one of the key builder also for infrastructure projects.
Right. Let me stay now at the Black Sea coast still. So we spoke about the port, but then there is also a recent development with regard to Abkhazia, which is also on the Black Sea coast, and it's a breakaway territory which Russia has controlled since 2008. There was recent statements by Russian government that they want to build a naval base in Abkhazia. What does it mean, Stefan? How do you perceive it? Is it more related to the dynamics inside the South Caucasus, or it has to do something with the war in Ukraine? What would Russia's benefit from that be?
I think it has to be something to do with the war, especially with the war in Ukraine, and the success also of the Ukrainian army to attack the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea and also on the territory or in the area of Ukraine, which is controlled by Russia now. So to protect the Black Sea Fleet, to have a safe haven also for reparation of ships, they need a different port, and that's why they were looking for alternatives, which is in Abkhazia, and they decided that they want to reconstruct or rebuild also this port. It's yet not ready for use, but they really need alternatives to the Crimean ports, since they are really under pressure to get more attacks from Ukraine. I think it has also other elements. We see more activities from Russia on Abkhazia, and also integrating Abkhazia with Russia, but also pressuring Abkhazia to open, for instance, the real estate market, and also using strategic infrastructure. It's also under discussion to open the railway line to Georgia, so that would also deeper connect Georgia with Russia in a way through Abkhazia. So I think there is also an economic and strategic element, but I think the decision for this port is mainly about the pressure Ukraine puts on the Black Sea Fleet.
Right. But basically, when we speak about Abkhazia and also South Ossetia, another region which is under Russian control, but part of Georgia's internationally recognized territory, we don't see much developments in terms of, well, I will put this big word here, conflict resolution, right? There has been this conflict, but there was also an international format for that, facilitated by the EU, the United Nations, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But so far, it has been deadlocked, right? Any prospects on that? Any new developments in these directions? Do you foresee them currently or not, Tina?
I think that will very much depend how the war ends and how Russia will position itself after the war with Ukraine. I mean, as Stefan said, investing now into the infrastructure in Abkhazia is indeed very strategically important for economic, political reasons, but also for Russia to show to Georgia, hey, I am not gone anywhere. This is my area. I will use it. I will utilize it. I will manipulate with it. And also, we're speaking about the region that didn't receive any investment from Russia, right? This also gives the hope for the Abkhaz population that, okay, we're going to now finally, after all these years, we'll invest something in this region. But the connecting Georgia with Russia through Abkhazia, I mean, the sad part here is that there is whatsoever no connection between Georgia and Abkhazia. Like for instance, draw the parallels with other conflicts, there are other countries which have the breakaway regions where, for instance, trade flows still. There is no connection, and this is a very sad reality. So Georgia and Abkhazia have absolutely no connection, no trade, no economic relations. So it's a very difficult conflict in a way, and it's been now around 3 decades. So it will be very difficult to resolve it because it's been simply the isolation. With the Geneva international discussions, right, that you had in mind, that really reached the standstill, basically because the interests are very, very different of Georgia and Russia. This really served to have the discussion about security, but when the understanding of security is so different between Georgia and Russia, it becomes very difficult. There was discussions also on the humanitarian assistance. But again, I mean, Russia was asking Georgia volunteered to have the non-use of force, but then Russia didn't reciprocate it, and also the request was for Georgia to, pause and stop military cooperation with NATO or with the US, or sign the agreements with the Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which Georgia does not recognize, right? Because they are invaded by Russia and they're under Russian occupation. So these are the requests that cannot be fulfilled by Georgia, and this is very similar, right? What Russia wanted Ukraine to do, never to join the NATO, or it's a very similar story that Russia plays with Georgia. So there's no surprise that basically these discussions did not get far, and they're basically in the deadlock.
Stefan, can the EU play a bigger role there? They have a monitoring mission on the borderline, and maybe some sort of assistance with people-to-people contacts could be one of the issues. I think
the problem is we have a trend of even more isolation of Abkhazia now with the war, with Russia's war against Ukraine, and the West-Russia conflict, which is also impacting on this conflict. So there were some formats also between Abkhazia and South Ossetia, people-to-people contacts. There are also EU projects and projects also of different member states on people-to-people contacts. But with this increasing isolation of Abkhazia and creeping also integration with Russia, it's becoming more and more difficult also to have these connections, to travel also, to leave the region, because normally people leave via Russia to other countries, yeah, and that's getting more difficult. I think the other aspect is we have at the moment a government in Georgia which don't want to touch this conflict. I think Ivanishvili has no interest in the conflict. He cannot win anything with it, but it's also somehow toxic. It's really a very emotional topic also for the Georgian society, and there is not really a proactive policy at the moment from the Georgian government side. So they just keep it like it is, which means again that Russia's activities to integrate, to isolate the region is growing. Yeah, so this is the more active part. Then from the Georgian side, which could maybe offer also more. There is support. There are projects, but there is also no flexibility, or very limited flexibility from the Georgian side. So I see rather that this war in Ukraine makes it even more difficult to de-isolate and to have progress also on this conflict.
All right. Yeah, you want to add something?
Yes, because that what Stefan raised is a very important point. Indeed, they don't want to touch this sensitive topic, but they also utilize it in a bad way, because what the Georgian Dream is now doing is saying, look what happened to Ukraine, because it wanted its European integration to the NATO, they are at war. And now, if you want to be at peace, we should not provoke Russia. So that's the line they take. They somehow still weaponize these breakaway regions, but do not try to resolve it. And it's very effective in a way to put this fear into the population. I've been recently in Georgia, and the fear is really real. People still think what will happen to us, because it's very easy for Russia to invade Georgia and to leverage on this occupation, and also building the military base in the South Ossetia. And the situation, there was time that could be, these people-to-people contacts could have been built. There could be something done there, but it's just simply, as Stefan said, is not a priority, is not on the agenda of the current government, which is very unfortunate.
All right. I think it's time to wrap up, and we covered a lot. We spoke about China, Russia, and Georgia, of course, in the first place. But maybe, to conclude this discussion, I would ask you, to answer, to have a very brief answer. What do you see the EU could do more in the coming months, in the coming years, to support Georgia's European integration? Stefan, let's start with you.
I think the candidate status is important for Georgia. So I think Georgia should be kept on the European path despite the backsliding of the government. And it should be really the support and engagement also with the society, and also bringing in this process of EU integration more the society, so more bottom-up than a top-down approach. I think it's a very much bureaucratic-driven top-down with the focus on the government process, which has not really an interest to integrate with the EU because it would question its power position. But we have an overall society which really wants to go on this European path. And I think it's crucial for Georgia, but also for the EU, to keep this country on the European path, but really to engage more on a bottom-up approach, which is the only way also to change politics and the political path the government is going at the moment. It has to come from the country, it has to come from the society, and I think that's the part with whom the EU has to engage much more and has to communicate also much better and much more targeted.
Yeah. So communication with the citizens would be one thing. Tina,
one thing, strategic communication, not the EU's strongest side, but definitely more investment is needed. I would add that because the scope of these conditions are so wide, because they're so demanding and requiring, it will be good EU to clarify further what exactly is expected into each priority, and also to actively monitor, assess, and have the feedback before we reach to the point when European Commission has to release the recommendation or the European Council should vote. No, there should be the process where EU is really closely engaged, EU monitors, and EU delivers the feedback. There was not much feedback delivered on the fulfillment of the previous priority. There was only one midterm review, which was verbal and very short. And so EU has a lot of tools. It can have a midterm review that should be not verbal, but in written, and have just simply more guidance to the country, what really needs to be done. This is the only way you can tie the country to the reforms and also, monitor that it's on the right path.
Thank you so much for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.